Verstappen wasn't supposed to win in Qatar. His car was unstable. He started third, and the championship was slipping away. But with one brutal call under the safety car, he outplayed McLaren and left Ferrari's Mekies stunned. Subscribe now, because what Max did wasn't just smart. It might have just saved his title fight. Max Verstappen wasn't expected to win in Qatar. The numbers didn't back him. The pace wasn't there. McLaren had locked out the front row with a dominant 1-2 in qualifying. Ferrari looked sharp in long-run simulations. And Red Bull? They were talking about damage control, not victory. Even Verstappen himself said on Saturday, "This one's not ours to take." But that wasn't the truth. That was misdirection. The real truth started to reveal itself on lap 7. When a collision between Gasly and Hülkenberg triggered a safety car, the paddock waited. Strategists paused. Pit walls hesitated. But Red Bull didn't. Verstappen dived into the pit lane. Hard tires on. Track position sacrificed temporarily. It looked like a gamble. But it wasn't. It was the first step in a complete takedown of McLaren and Ferrari, executed not on track, but on paper. Red Bull didn't wait to see what McLaren would do. They forced McLaren to respond. And by the time Norris and Piastri reacted, it was already too late. When they stopped under green flag conditions, Verstappen emerged in clean air. Ahead. No battles. No overtakes. Just precision. McLaren had out-qualified him. Ferrari had out-tested him. But Max had outthought them all. Laurent Mekies, watching from the Ferrari pit wall, saw the shape of the race change in real time, and there was nothing he could do. Hamilton was struggling with balance. Leclerc couldn't find grip. Ferrari was watching Red Bull win not with pace, but with clarity. It wasn't just a defeat. It was a humiliation. Mekies had expected a McLaren fight. Instead, he saw Verstappen turn a flawed car into a flawless performance. The RB21 wasn't perfect. It wasn't even great. The car showed understeer in Sector 1 and rear instability into Turn 12. But Verstappen didn't need a perfect car. He needed a clean window, consistent tires, and silence on the radio. That's what he got. While others pushed, panicked, and pitted late, Verstappen stayed calm. His lap times didn't jump. His inputs didn't change. He turned strategy into speed. McLaren had the pace to win. Ferrari had the pressure to prove something. But Verstappen had nothing to lose, and that made him dangerous. He didn't drive like someone defending a championship. He drove like someone taking it back. And what made it worse for his rivals was how easy he made it look. He didn't attack. He waited. And when they blinked, he struck. So if you want more than just the final results, if you want to understand how Max Verstappen turned a quiet Sunday into a strategic masterclass, subscribe now. Because Qatar wasn't just a win. It was a statement. The title fight is back on. And Verstappen just made it personal. What happened in Qatar wasn't a surprise for those watching closely. It was a carefully crafted trap. Max Verstappen arrived at the Lusail circuit knowing Red Bull didn't have the fastest package. The RB21 lacked front-end grip on entry and was chewing through the rear tires under load. In every practice session, Verstappen's sector times lagged behind McLaren. But that never mattered. Because Red Bull didn't come to fight. They came to outthink. Qatar 2025 was meant to be a McLaren coronation. Oscar Piastri was on pole, Lando Norris had the championship lead, and the paddock was buzzing about McLaren's late-season form. Red Bull? They had the third-best qualifying time on a car that looked nervous through the medium-speed corners. Even Ferrari had reasons to feel optimistic. Hamilton had shown strong long-run pace, and Leclerc was finally getting consistency out of the SF25. But by Sunday night, none of that mattered. The race started clean. Piastri pulled away. Norris shadowed him. Verstappen settled into third, holding position. But on lap 7, everything changed. A collision further down the field brought out the safety car. In that moment, Red Bull's years of strategic sharpness kicked in. Verstappen dove into the pits for hard tires. Everyone else stayed out waiting, hesitating, calculating. And just like that, Verstappen flipped the entire race structure upside down. What looked like an early gamble was actually Red Bull's blueprint. They knew the race would stretch tire life to the edge. They knew McLaren was likely to split strategy. And they knew Ferrari had a history of reacting late. So they took the initiative. One stop early. Fresh tires. Track position eventually. While others debated, Max was already committing to the long game, a game nobody else seemed ready to play. As the race unfolded, McLaren tried to respond. But by the time Norris and Piastri made their stops under green flag conditions, it was too late. Verstappen had already built enough margin to jump them both. Not by overtaking. Not by outpacing. Simply by timing. And once he was in front, the rhythm was unshakable. McLaren had to chase. Ferrari had to survive. Verstappen just had to manage. For Ferrari, the contrast was painful. Hamilton's radio was filled with frustration over traction. Leclerc couldn't maintain tire temperature. The SF25 looked skittish and unprepared. Mekies watched both his cars fall backwards, not because they lacked pace in theory, but because they had no grip in practice. Verstappen, by contrast, was executing a flawless second stint, running consistent laps, and building pressure without ever leaving his comfort zone. That's why Qatar matters. Because it wasn't about dominance. It was about disruption. Verstappen walked into a race designed for his rivals, rewrote the tactical script in one lap, and walked away with full control. It wasn't a comeback drive. It was a checkmate. And with only one round left in the season, the entire championship narrative shifted. McLaren has the lead. But Verstappen has the momentum and the scars to prove he's not finished. From the moment Verstappen rejoined the track after his lap 7 stop, his rhythm became undeniable. His lap times weren't headline-grabbing, but they were relentless. Between laps 12 and 30, Max never deviated more than 0.2 per lap. In a Grand Prix known for brutal degradation and unpredictable track evolution, that kind of consistency isn't just impressive, it's lethal. The raw numbers told a quiet story. Verstappen wasn't pushing for purple sectors. He was driving to delta. While McLaren drivers burned through their first stints attempting to build a gap before their stops, Max conserved. His tire wear was almost flat compared to Norris over the same stint length. His degradation curve dropped off a full lap later. And in a race where timing the pit window was everything, that margin was pure gold. Telemetry analysis after the race revealed how Verstappen achieved this. His throttle application was reduced in key traction zones by roughly 7% compared to Norris. In turns 6 and 10, he lifted earlier, letting the car rotate naturally, rather than forcing rear grip. It didn't look fast, but it allowed the RB21 to maintain stability across the stint. Every lift, every correction, was part of the long game. Meanwhile, Lando Norris was pushing harder because he had to. McLaren's race was built on trying to maintain track position after staying out under the safety car. But once Verstappen got ahead, they lost the tire advantage. Norris's rear left temperature spiked, and his degradation curve collapsed 4 laps earlier than Red Bull's models had predicted. That's why he lost time not in seconds, but in tenths that added up quietly. Ferrari's data told an even more dramatic story. Charles Leclerc's SF25 was never in the race. His rear tire load through turn 4 dropped by nearly 20% compared to Red Bull and McLaren. That's not a setup issue, that's a platform failure. Hamilton's car was worse. Brake instability and a late pit call dropped him into dirty air, where he couldn't get tire temps back into the working window. They weren't fighting for podiums. They were fighting to stay in Q3 pace. But Verstappen didn't win by default. He won by building margin, minute by minute. The team gave him sector delta information, not panic messages. Lambiase would call out gaps like Oscar is 0.3 quicker in sector 2, and Max would simply acknowledge and adjust. No need to overdrive. No need to push. He had the strategic map memorized and more importantly, he trusted it. That's what let him drive without looking in his mirrors. So while the headline said Verstappen wins from third, the reality was more brutal. Verstappen never gave his rivals a chance. Not through speed. Through silence. He used consistency, tire understanding, and micro adjustments in driving technique to build a wall they couldn't climb. And in doing so, he turned a damaged weekend into a declaration of intent. The RB21 Verstappen drove in Qatar wasn't a dominant machine. On paper, it was compromised. The car had struggled all weekend with mid-corner instability and inconsistent rotation, especially through turns 6, 9, and 12. The team had originally set up the car with high front wing load to compensate, but that created oversteer on traction and unpredictable rear behavior under braking. Verstappen wasn't working with an ideal tool. He was managing around a limitation. Red Bull made a bold pre-race call by adjusting rear suspension stiffness, trading peak cornering performance for ride predictability and better tire longevity. It wasn't a transformation, but it gave Max something critical: confidence. With a more stable platform, he could push into corners like turn 4 without the rear stepping out unexpectedly. That small margin of control allowed him to shift his driving toward efficiency, not aggression, and that was the difference. Verstappen's brake traces were smoother than any of the front runners. He braked earlier, but with more linear pressure. This wasn't about slowing down, it was about load management. Earlier brake points allowed for better weight distribution, which gave him a sharper but safer turn-in. The RB21 still had understeer, but now it was predictable and Max could drive on the edge without crossing it. Through corners like turn 10 and notoriously difficult traction zone, Verstappen used 8–12% less throttle application during the initial phase compared to Norris. This wasn't because he was slower, it was because he was extending tire life. That single micro adjustment added 4 more laps to his optimal pace window. And in a race where stint management meant everything, those 4 laps made the undercut irrelevant. Radio between Max and Gianpiero Lambiase confirmed this calculated approach. Every call was met with short, confident replies. Oscars closing in Sector 3. Max, copy. No argument. No uncertainty. Verstappen adjusted mid-race balance on his own, making subtle changes to brake migration and differential settings. He wasn't reacting, he was shaping the car beneath him in real time. The RB21 still showed its limits. On corner exit in Sector 1, the rear end stepped out multiple times on onboard. Max had to feather the throttle on almost every lap to avoid wheel spin, especially on the aging hard compound. But not once did he overcorrect. His steering was smooth, deliberate, almost quiet. That's not just car control, it's emotional control. He drove like a man managing a gap, not defending it. By lap 35, the race wasn't about speed anymore. It was about preservation of tires, track position, and the championship itself. Verstappen took a car that wasn't at its best, neutralized its flaws, and weaponized its consistency. And that's what left engineers like Laurent Mekies in disbelief. Not that Max won, but that he won in a car that should not have had the tools to do it.